Okay. Now I'll just pop open my chat window over here. Okay, so here's what's going on the next 2 weeks. So what we want to do today, number one is I just wanted to check in and see how things are going, how everyone's doing. So I did post an announcement about an hour ago. Some of you have already had a look at it. There's no real due date on it, but I just posted a quick survey. Your answers are anonymous, where I'm just trying to get a sense of, how is remote learning going for you in general? How is this class going for you in general? If you have some suggestions about what would make the class work better for you, there's a place for you to enter that. And then also just a question around, how's your mental well-being doing? This is really unfamiliar. This isn't necessarily the learning environment that we thought we would have. So just a question about how are you adjusting to that, as well as there's some information about where you can get some supports from the college if you need them. So that survey's up. It's in the assignments tab, but you can also get the link from the announcements as well. So if you have a few minutes to fill that out, I'd really appreciate hearing from you and getting some feedback on how the semester is going and how you are doing. So what we want to do today is we want to look at and start using our SQL Server database. So it's a completely separate database system from the MySQL system that we used back in our PHP course. Has some similarities with MySQL, but also has a lot more power to it, a lot more features and functionality. So we're going to talk a little bit about SQL Server, and we're going to look at two ways to set up our databases. We can set up, if you're running Windows, which most of you, but not everyone is. If you're running Windows, probably the fastest way for doing development is to set up a local database. So that way our IIS Express, our local application, we're just connecting all within our own laptop. That connection's really fast. So that's typically how I'm going to run my game store. I'm going to use the local database. But we're also going to set up, and I'm going to show you how to set up a database in the Microsoft Azure Cloud platform. And there's two purposes of having the Azure database. Number one, for your assignment, you need to use the Azure database. You can't use a local database because I won't be able to run, your application won't run online on the internet unless you have a live database running on the Azure server. The other reason Azure is going to be important is for the Mac users in the class. You won't be able to run SQL Server locally on your Mac. So your only choice, even for the game store, is to use your Azure database. Now, Azure allows us to set up multiple databases, but what I think is going to be easier is we'll just use one database, much like we did with our PHP class. We had one database and we used that same database online. It was on the AWS platform. We used it for the music library we built in class, and then you also use that same database for your assignment. So it will be the same, particularly if you're a Mac user. We'll create one Azure database. You can use it for our online store we're building together, and you can also use that same database for your assignment. You don't have to set up two separate ones. So we're going to talk about the DB context, which is the object in .NET that is used for connecting to databases. We're going to plan out and we're going to create the database for our video game store. And then we're going to use some scaffolding tools, so some code generation tools in Visual Studio, that once we have our database and our model set up, we can automatically build working controllers and views without writing any code. We can get Visual Studio to build those for us. So that should be most of what you need to complete assignment 1B. Just a couple things in terms of the timing of today's class as well as next week. I know normally I've been trying to keep our classes to about 2 hours and finish around 1 o'clock. Today's class will probably be longer. We'll probably be closer to a 2 o'clock end time for two reasons. Number one is we had our guest talk for 30 minutes. So that took up some of our time. the other thing is, this is a really important lesson, because if we can't, it's important we can set up our database and connect to it, because all the other things we want to do in the course are dependent on completing the steps we do in this lesson. So I don't want to rush through it. I want to take the time to do it properly and explain things clearly. So for that, I'm kind of expecting that we'll use most of that third hour of class today. That won't be typical that we'll take 3 hours, but where we need to, we will. And I think today is definitely one of the times where we may need to do that. I certainly don't want to rush this part of the lesson. The other thing is next week's class. So next Monday is Thanksgiving, so we do not have a synchronous class. So what we're going to do next week, there is still going to be a lesson next week, but I'm simply going to record it. I'll break it up. Next week's lesson won't be nearly as long, and the things we're going to do are much less complicated than what we're doing this week. So I'm just going to record the videos, and you're free to watch them on your own time and still go through and make the changes to the video game store that I'm going to do in next week's class. Okay. If you have questions, I will have office hours next week on Tuesday as well as on Thursday. So you're free to book some time with me if you have any issues or have questions. Okay. So there will still be a quiz due on Sunday as usual. And next week's lesson will be like a regular lesson. You're just going to do it on your own time. But the expectation is in week 6, when we come back, that you will have completed, made the changes to your video game store that I record next week. Okay. Does anybody have any questions before we kind of get started and dive into today's lesson? Okay. So I did send you a brief homework assignment, if you will. Normally I do this activity in class, but knowing that we were going to have Brando, Omar, and Andre join us in class today, I sent you a link to a 9-minute introductory video about SQL Server, and I just asked you to make some notes as to why we might use this database technology. So I'll just ask you, you can use the chat or you can use your mic. If you've watched the video, which hopefully you have, I know some of you certainly have already, what are some of the reasons that we're going to use this database technology in this class? And I'll add these lists to my item here on Blackboard. Liam, could you be a little more specific about that? Okay, yep. I'll just copy some of the things you've found in here. It's easy to configure. Yep, that's a great point, Maggie. It's very feature rich. So there's lots of tools that allow us to interpret and analyze the data. Any other reasons you got from watching the video why SQL Server is a database that we might choose to use? Why are we using it? Yep, so supports multiple databases. Yep, it's got data recovery backups. You're right, Liam. Why in this class particularly? Why when we're learning ASP.NET, why would we learn SQL Server and use it if we're using ASP.NET for our web development stack? Right. Okay. Yes, Farouk. So, and in the bigger picture, basically integration with any Microsoft product, especially. It's pretty rare to see ASP.NET web applications that don't use SQL Server as the database. It's possible, but that's kind of the default choice, and they integrate and they work very well. So yes, the .NET Entity allows us to create models. So I'll add that under here as well. In the video, they also talked about web hosting. So this is an important reason to consider SQL Server. Did anybody who watched the video happen to note that, what they said, what the instructor said about hosting? Okay, let's go look at a couple of web hosting companies. So we build a web application, and now we need to host it somewhere. So we're going to find, I don't know, maybe something like web hosting. Maybe we'll look at Windows web hosting. So we have MySQL and MS SQL. This is SQL Server. So how many choices do we have here for different types of databases? GoDaddy is one of the world's biggest hosting companies. So these are our options. Yeah, so we've got limited options. Basically, the only two choices we have in most shared hosting environments is we can use MySQL or we can use SQL Server. Now, if you wanted to install SQL Server like on your own web server, the license is very expensive. But when you're using a shared host, it's the hosting company like GoDaddy that pays this licensing cost. So we can use their SQL Server license for our database, and we don't have to pay a licensing cost. So it's supported by many web hosts on shared servers where the host pay the licensing costs. So most web hosts will typically offer you MySQL or SQL Server, and that's about it. So if you don't want to use MySQL, SQL Server is typically your only other choice in a shared hosting environment. Okay, so I did ask you to install, if you are a Windows user, I've asked you to install the server technology, install the server, as well as install Management Studio, which is the program that's much like MySQL Workbench, but for SQL Server. And if you're a Mac user, I sent you the link to Azure Data Studio. That will allow you to connect to your database that we create on Azure. So we're going to Justin, I'm just looking at your question. Where do they host their site? Well, they host it on their own servers. So they have their own web servers, and these hosting plans, you can rent space each month on their server. So how popular is SQL Server? So here's a quick ranking. This is updated So there's really three really popular relational database systems in use. Oracle is probably the biggest, slightly the most popular. MySQL is kind of a close second, and Microsoft SQL Server is not far behind. So you can see in terms of usage, at least by this metrics, yeah, these are really the big three, and everything else is only half the size at best. Next semester in our advanced server-side scripting, we'll use MongoDB, which is a document database. It's not a relational database, but you can see that these are really the big three. Yeah, that's right. There, it is super popular. But you'll notice Oracle, even as the most popular, Oracle is not typically a choice that's made available by web hosts. They don't usually buy an Oracle license and allow us as web developers to create Oracle databases on shared servers, not generally done. So SQL Server is one of the most popular databases. So I'm going to just talk about it. You know, you guys have watched that intro video, but I want to talk about it a little bit in the context of working with it in ASP.NET and how we're going to set it up and then connect to it from within our Visual Studio application. Okay, so these slides, I'm going to go through them a little bit. They're here, the week 4 slides, they're here on Blackboard. So if you've watched the video, you have had a little bit of an introduction. We're going to set up a database locally today and configure our Get Me a Game web application to connect to it. We're going to build some models, all the models that we need for our store we're going to build. So they're going to look something like this. And then we're going to use a tool in Visual Studio called migrations that I think Farouk mentioned earlier that will take our models and then automatically build the matching tables in our database. And then we're going to use scaffolding, some auto generation tools to build our controllers and views. So that's what we want to do today. So I'm going to show you first, if you were able to successfully install SQL Server on your local computer. Yep, the migrations happen within Visual Studio, so you will be able to run them on your Mac once you have your database set up, yes. So first I'm going to go through the process for the Windows users in the class of how you can set the database up on your local computer. So in order to do this, you need to have installed both SQL Server, which is the database program itself, and you need Management Studio, which is the application that we use to connect to and manage our databases. So I'm going to open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to use it regularly, so I've pinned mine to my Start menu. You can just search for it. If you search for the word management on Windows, it should come up. If you're a Mac user, just bear with me for a few minutes, okay? We'll go through the process of setting up your database on Azure and connecting to it. We'll go through that process shortly. So I'm going to open up Management Studio. The process in Azure Data Studio for Mac users is going to be similar, except you'll only be connecting to Azure. You're not going to be able to create a local database like the Windows users can. So when the program first opens, you're going to get this window. It's probably going to look like this. It's going to say server name, and the authentication is going to default to Windows authentication. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to find my local server. So I'm going to click this drop down on the server name. I have a whole bunch of options here. Yours is probably going to be empty, but at the very bottom, there will be an option that says Browse for More. So I'm going to click on that. It'll bring up this little window that says Browse for Servers. Keep in mind, you only have to do this once. This is just creating the database. Once we do this, we can just click Connect to connect to it. I'm going to expand Database Engine. And under here, it's either going to say local or it's going to have the name of your computer. So this is, I'm on a college computer, so this is the name of my computer. So I'm just going to select my computer name and click OK. Now from here, Diana, you have two. What are the names? So you may have two instances installed. Okay, you should be able to just pick the first one, Liam. If it doesn't, and Diana, if it doesn't work, we'll then try connecting to the other one. So the default authentication method is Windows, meaning you don't need a separate username and password to connect to your local SQL server. It just authenticates through your Windows account. So to try this, mine is not set up this way, but to see if it works, you just click the connect button. I get login failed because I did not set up Windows authentication. Okay. If you do, then you have to change the authentication to SQL Server. And you have to put in the username and the password that you set up when you installed the program. The default username, which I'll put in the chat, is simply SA, which stands for System Admin. Your password would be a password that you set up. So I can't tell you what that is. So if Windows authentication doesn't work, change to SQL Server authentication, enter SA in the username and enter the password. And then you want to check off remember password. Yeah, try Windows first, Stephen, because that's the default. So if you don't change it when you install the program, it defaults to Windows. I changed mine to use SQL Server authentication instead. So that's why Windows authentication gives me an error. And then I'll just click connect here. And it opens this window on the bottom left called the Object Explorer. It shows I'm connected to my local server, shows me the version. And then I have this little tree structure with a bunch of folders. And if I expand databases, here are the list of databases I have so far on my local server. So all I want to do, and I can just do this with a couple of clicks, I'm just going to create a new database for our video game store. Shubnik, first you should try Windows authentication. So Windows is the default. I use SQL Server because I changed it when I installed the program. So once you connect, you just expand databases. And if I just select the word databases here, Hung, I won't be able to upload it that quickly because it takes when I'm recording through WebEx. Yes, Stephen, that's exactly right. When I record through WebEx, it saves it in its own file, and then it takes an hour or two to convert to an MP4. So I can't upload right away. But I can quickly show you again what we did. So then I just right-click the word databases and choose new database. And I'm going to give it a name. I'll call it Get Me a Game. You can use any database name you like, but there can't be spaces in the name. And then I just click OK. Hung, I will go through that process again quickly because it won't take very long. So now I have on my local server, I have a new empty database. There are no tables in my database yet. It's just blank. So I'm going to close my program out and I'll go through that one more time quickly for Windows users. So I search for the word manage and I open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. I'm using 2017. If you have a newer version, that's fine. The version doesn't matter. It's not going to affect it if you have an older or a newer version from me. When the program first opens up, you're going to get an authentication screen that looks like this. So under server name, if you click the drop-down arrow and click Browse for More, you then open up the Database Engine section and just pick your server name. It's probably your computer name. It might just have the word local instead. Whatever's here, as long as there's a server running on your computer, you just select it and click OK, and you should be able to click Connect. Okay, Ginal, did you install SQL Server or only Management Studio? You need to install both programs. Well, you don't need to redo it. We need to check if you have the program. So let's check that first. I'll show you how to check. So Hung, once you're connected, you just right click and choose New Database and put in a new database name with no spaces and click OK. So now, if you want to check if you have the server, is actually in your Programs menu. You should have this program, SQL Server Installation Center. That will tell you if the program is installed. And when you install the program, and I made a note of this in the instructions, under Install, you choose this option, New Installation or Add Features to an Existing one. You must make sure the Database Engine component is checked. If you don't check the Database Engine component, the program installs, but the server doesn't install. That is the server piece. So if you don't see any server in Management Studio, your server has not been installed. So you have to run the installer again and choose this option. And make sure you enable the Database Engine component. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. Let's open up our Get Me a Game project. I'm just going to get the project running. So I'll use my debug menu and start without debugging. And it is noon, so we'll just get it running and then we're going to take a break here. And the first thing that we will do when we come back is go through the process of setting up our database on Azure. So everybody's going to do this because that way you'll have the database set up that you can use for your assignment. And if you are on a Mac or if you don't have the program running locally, you'll have the ability to also use our Azure database for the video game shop. Yep, I just opened the project we've been working on, Stephen. Yep. and I click debug and start without debugging, this starts our local IIS Express server and launches the application in the browser. Okay, it's 12:03. We'll take a break. We'll come back at 12:15. Okay, I'm going to step away for a couple minutes. I'll try to come back before 12:15 in case somebody needs a bit of tech support, but we'll resume then and we'll set up our Azure database. As I said, you're only going to have to do this once. So if we do it together, you won't have to worry about doing the setup later on your own. Okay, so I'm going to pause. I will turn my camera and mic back on when I sit back down.